Good morning, students. Bio 102, Lecture 11. We have one more to go and then we're done with the book. And now we're going to be talking about ecology and ecosystems. So now we're no longer talking about ourselves. We're going to talk about ourselves in a different way. We step back. First of all, we need to know what is an ecosystem. An ecosystem consists of a community of biological as well as abiotic factors with which they interact. Ecosystems range from a microcosm, such as an aquarium, to a larger area, such as a lake or a forest. Regardless of an ecosystem's size, its dynamics involve two main processes: energy flow and chemical cycling. So these both happen in an ecosystem. Energy flows through a system, whereas matter cycles within it. Here is energy flow and matter cycling shown. And so here's a glacier in Antarctica, and you see that some of it looks yucky and colored, red and brown, and those are chemoautotrophic bacteria that are living in the ice. So energy is cycling through, and so is matter in that particular ecosystem. Here is another ecosystem, so this would be more like a desert, and it should, well, shrub. It's more shrub-like, and you can see matter and a lot of energy bound up. And so this brings us to the laws of thermodynamics. Laws of physics and chemistry apply to ecosystems, including energy flow. The first law of thermodynamics states that energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. Energy enters an ecosystem as solar radiation, and it is conserved, and then it's lost from organisms as heat. The second law of thermodynamics states that with every energy exchange, that increases the entropy of the universe. So some is always lost as heat. In an ecosystem, energy conversions are not completely efficient, and some energy is always lost as heat. And we will see this and see how they become inefficient. Then we also have the laws of physics of conservation of mass. The law of conservation of mass states that matter cannot be created or destroyed, and so the chemical elements are continually being recycled within ecosystems. In a forest ecosystem, most nutrients enter as dust or solutes in rain and are carried away in water. Ecosystems are open systems, which means that there's an open exchange between energy and matter. They absorb energy and mass and release energy and mass, which is energy as heat and waste products. Autotrophs. So let's look at energy, mass, and trophic levels. Autotrophs build molecules themselves using photosynthesis or chemosynthesis as an energy source. Heterotrophs, however, depend on the biosynthetic output of other organisms. So they have to depend on autotrophs to do something for them, otherwise they can't exist. Energy and nutrients pass from primary producers, called autotrophs, to primary consumers, which are herbivores, to secondary consumers, which are carnivores, to tertiary consumers, which would be other carnivores that feed on other carnivores. So that's how energy is moved around in a ecosystem. We also have the role of detritivores. These are decomposers. They're consumers that derive their energy from detritus, or non-living organic matter. Prokaryotes and fungus are very important detritivores. Decomposition connects all trophic levels, and it becomes a cycle. The rate of decomposition is controlled by temperature, moisture, and availability of nutrients, of course. What do decomposers do? Rapid decomposition results in relatively low levels of nutrients in the soil. For instance, in a tropical rainforest, material decomposes pretty rapidly, and most nutrients are tied up in trees and other living organisms. But in cold and wet ecosystems, they store a large amount of undecomposed organic matter because decomposition rates are really, really slow. Decomposition is also slow in anaerobic muds. So here is decomposition going on. You can see fungus doing their work on some dead tree. Here is a cycle that shows you that all energy is coming from the sun. This is trapped, and notice how big the arrow is. It's trapped by primary producers, which of course are going to lose a bunch of energy as heat. And then the primary producers are going to then be eaten by primary consumers. And again, some energy is going to be lost as heat. Primary producers will die, and then the detritivores will eat them up. The primary consumers are going to be eaten by secondary and tertiary consumers, and again, some energy is going to be lost as heat. And when they die, they will also be eaten by detritivores, and then the material is cycled back, and the energy, of course, is lost at every level. So that shows you the chemical cycling and the energy flow. In most ecosystems, primary production is the amount of light energy converted to chemical energy by autotrophs during a given time period. In a few ecosystems, chemoautotrophs are the primary producers. The extent of photosynthetic production sets the spending limit for an ecosystem's energy budget. There's also something called a global energy budget. The amount of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface limits the photosynthetic output of ecosystems. So you obviously can't produce more than you receive. So we need to know how much is the global energy budget before we can determine what ecosystems are going to be using how much of that budget. Only a small fraction of solar energy actually strikes photosynthetic organisms, and even less is of a usable wavelength. So most of the energy that comes from the sun is actually just lost. We don't actually use it at all. And then there are these terms called gross production and net production. Total primary production is known as the ecosystem's gross primary production, or GPP. GPP is measured as the conversion of chemical energy from photosynthesis per unit time. Net primary production, or NPP, is GPP minus the energy used by primary producers for respiration. So, the primary producers are going to be using a little bit of the energy. Yes, they are converting most of it, but they're using some of it for themselves. So we want to minus that out to get the net primary production, which is stuff we can actually use. Net primary production is expressed as energy per unit area per unit time, or joules per meter squared per year. Or it can also be expressed as biomass added per unit area per unit time, which would be grams per meter squared per year. Net primary production is the amount of new biomass added in a given time period, and only net primary production is available to consumers. Standing crops, those would be the total biomass of the photosynthetic autotrophs at any given time. Ecosystems vary greatly in net primary production and contribution to the total net primary production on Earth. Some do more, some do less. Let's look at the global net primary production. Tropical rainforests, estuaries, and coral reefs are among the most productive ecosystems per unit area. Marine ecosystems are relatively unproductive per unit area, but contribute much to the global net primary production because of their volume, just because they're big. Here, what we see is what areas produce more. Anything that's in purple doesn't produce anything. So that's mostly the oceans, but because they're so big, even if there's a little bit of production in there, it adds up. But you can see that most of our production is not that much. If you're looking for the reds, they're very few. That's net primary production in terms of carbon, kilograms of carbon per meter squared per year. Notice the big desert in Africa, nothing. Saudi Arabia, nothing. Greenland, North America, North Pole, nothing. South Pole, nothing. Pacific, nothing. Big areas that are complete deserts for primary production. Net ecosystem production, or NEP, is the total biomass accumulation during a given period. Net ecosystem production is gross primary production minus the total respiration of all the organisms, producers and consumers, in an ecosystem. And why do we do this? Why do we minus that out? Because net ecosystem production is estimated by comparing the net flux of carbon dioxide and oxygen in an ecosystem, which are two molecules connected by photosynthesis. If there's release of oxygen by a system, it indicates it's also storing carbon dioxide. So how do we find, how did we make that map? Well, we can reveal ocean production by many ways. We have floats that descend and park themselves, and then they sample the oxygen in the area, and then they record the oxygen, and they come back to the surface, and then they transmit the data to the satellite, which is then picked up. Primary production in aquatic ecosystems. So let's look at those. In marine and freshwater ecosystems, both light and nutrients control primary production. Depth of light penetration affects primary production in the photic zone of an ocean or lake. More than light, nutrients limit primary production in regions of the ocean and in lakes. A limiting nutrient is the element that must be added for production to increase. So there are a lot of limiting nutrients. You may have light, but you might not have a nutrient, and that's not going to allow a lot of biomass to be accumulating. Nitrogen and phosphorus are the nutrients that most often limit marine production. The upwelling of nutrient-rich waters in parts of oceans contributes to regions of high primary production. The addition of large amounts of nutrients to lakes has a wide range of ecological impacts. In some areas, sewage runoff has caused eutrophication of lakes, which is bad, which can lead to loss of most fish species. In lakes, phosphorus limits cyanobacterial growth more often than nitrogen does. In terrestrial ecosystems, temperature and moisture affect primary production on a large scale. Primary production increases with moisture. Actual evapotranspiration is the water transpired by plants and evaporated from a landscape. And this is affected by precipitation, by temperature, and by solar energy. A soil nutrient is often the limiting factor in primary production. In terrestrial ecosystems, nitrogen is the most common limiting nutrient. Phosphorus is also a limiting nutrient, especially in older soils. So what are the adaptations to access nutrients? Well, some plants form mutualisms with nitrogen-fixing bacteria, because the only living things that are able to fix atmospheric nitrogen are bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Many plants form mutualisms with mycorrhizal fungi, which supply plants with phosphorus and other limiting elements. Roots have root hairs that increase surface area. Many plants release enzymes that increase the availability of limiting nutrients. So there are many ways to get around it. But at each trophic level, there's a huge loss. So the energy transfer between trophic levels is typically only 10% efficient. So you lose about 90% of energy at every trophic level. Secondary production of an ecosystem is the amount of chemical energy in food converted to new biomass during a given period of time. So when a caterpillar feeds on a leaf, only about 1/6 of the leaf's energy is used for secondary production. An organism's production efficiency is the fraction of energy stored in food that's not used for respiration. Birds and mammals have efficiencies in the range of only 1 to 3% because of the high cost of endothermy. So can't really store a lot. Fishes have production efficiencies of about 10%. Insects and microorganisms have efficiencies of about 40%. So we're pretty pathetic with our production efficiency, aren't we? And so here we see energy partitioning within a link of the food chain. So we have a plant material which has been eaten by a caterpillar. And let's say 200 joules is the total that is being eaten by the caterpillar. Well, straight away, 100 of that is just not going to be assimilated. So you lose half of it right away. Gone. Out of that, the animal is going to use about 1/3 of that for respiration. Gone. So you're left with only 33 joules to make new biomass, which is secondary production. So you can see, this is not a really good way to go about business. Trophic efficiency is the percentage of production transferred from one trophic level to the next. It's usually about 10%, with a range of about 5 to 20%. Trophic efficiency is multiplied over the length of a food chain. Approximately 0.1% of chemical energy fixed by photosynthesis reaches a tertiary consumer. A pyramid of net production represents the loss of energy within each transfer within a food chain. And here you see what happens. Again, it's the same idea as the caterpillar, but now we're looking at, instead of just the caterpillar himself, how much energy are we squandering away? So let's say we have 1 million joules of sunlight in one day. Well, only 10,000 joules is actually going to be fixed by a plant. So we're going to lose all the other, practically the whole million. But that 10,000 joules is going to be used by the plant, and then when a primary consumer will come along and eat the plant, so that will take about, it won't take all 10,000, it will lose 9,000 of it, 90% will be lost, and it will only be able to take 1,000 joules and make more biomass from that. Well, let's say then secondary consumer comes along and he wants to eat the primary consumer, which is an herbivore, and he's going to get, and again, a 90% loss. So for 1,000 joules, he only gets 100 joules from eating that bug, which is pathetic. But 100 joules is what he's going to be able to use for his needs, and probably has to eat a lot of bugs to put any mass down. Well, you finally have a tertiary consumer, and that's the end of the food chain, and that would be a carnivore eating this other carnivore. And when he does eat one mouse, he's going to get 90% of that energy that's stored in him, which is already pretty low. So he's only going to get 10 joules. Out of 1 million joules, you end up with 10 joules. So you can't go any further. And that's why the food chain has to finally terminate after a maximum of 4 links. Life depends on recycling chemical elements, and that brings us to biogeochemical cycles. Biogeochemical cycles are nutrient cycles in ecosystems involving biotic and abiotic components. Gaseous carbon, oxygen, sulfur, and nitrogen occur in the atmosphere and cycle globally. Less mobile elements include phosphorus, potassium, and calcium. These elements cycle locally in terrestrial systems, but more broadly when dissolved in aquatic systems. A model of nutrient cycling includes main reservoirs of elements and processes that transfer elements between reservoirs. All elements cycle between organic and inorganic reservoirs. So the water cycle, so this is one cycle. Water is essential to all organisms. Liquid water is a primary physical phase in which water is used. The oceans contain 97% of the biosphere's water, 2% is in glaciers and polar ice caps, 1% is in lakes, rivers, and groundwater. And so very little is actually there for us. Water moves by the process of evaporation, transpiration, condensation, precipitation, and movement through surface and groundwater. And this is the water cycle, as you can see, all those movements: precipitation over land, percolation through the soil, runoff and groundwater, evapotranspiration from the land, evaporation from the ocean, movement over land by wind, and then going back again. The carbon cycle. Carbon-based organic molecules are essential to all organisms. Photosynthetic organisms convert carbon dioxide to organic molecules that are used by heterotrophs. Carbon reservoirs include fossil fuels, soils, sediments, solutes in oceans, plant and animal biomass, the atmosphere, maybe small, but it's still a reservoir, and sedimentary rocks. Carbon dioxide is taken up and released through photosynthesis and respiration. It's also released by volcanoes and burning of fossil fuels. They also contribute to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And here is a carbon cycle. So here we see carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. It's taken up by photosynthesis, which is then used by these consumers. But they are respiring, so cellular respiration is going to bring back the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. However, some of the carbon is locked up in them, so they die, they decompose, and you can burn fossil fuels, and which is really dead animals or plants, and so you can get it back. This is the cycling of a carbon atom itself. So if you have one atom of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, it could, by photosynthesis, become part of a plant, and then it could be consumed by an herbivore and become its biomass. The herbivore could die, and you would have decomposition of that herbivore, and then it would become part of the decomposer's biomass, and he would finally respire it away, and it would go back into the atmosphere. So that would be what a carbon molecule would do, hypothetically. The nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen is a component of amino acids, of proteins, and of nucleic acids, and so it's very important for life. The main reservoir of nitrogen is the atmosphere, where it's present as molecular nitrogen. But this nitrogen must be converted to ammonium or nitrate for uptake by plants via nitrogen fixation by bacteria. We cannot use molecular nitrogen. Organic nitrogen is decomposed by ammonium, by ammonification, and ammonium is decomposed to nitrate by nitrification. Denitrification, which is unfortunate, will convert nitrate back into molecular nitrogen, which is unfortunate because now it's lost. And this shows you the cycling of nitrogen through our world, where we have nitrogen, molecular nitrogen in the atmosphere. We will have plants that will actually fix this, but some of it is going to go into decomposition and sedimentation, which will become dissolved again. We could fix some, but with the lightning, but this is a very slow cycle to move. The phosphorus cycle is even slower. The phosphorus is a major constituent of nucleic acids and of phospholipids, and of course ATP, adenosine triphosphate. Phosphate is the most important inorganic form of phosphorus. The largest reservoirs of phosphorus are sedimentary rocks of marine origin, the oceans, and of course organisms. Phosphate binds with soil particles, and movement is often very localized. So the phosphorus cycle is difficult. Mobilization of phosphorus is very hard. Once you have an uptake by a plant, and the plant is consumed, and then the plant and the animal dies, it's going to be bound in the rocks, and unless the rocks are near some source of water, it won't dissolve in, and if it does, it could, deposit down. These sediments would ultimately have to be uplifted by some tectonic force, and then the phosphorus could be blown away by wind and come back and land on the soil again. This is very difficult, so this is a very slow cycle. We do have bioremediation, where we're trying to detoxify ecosystems that we've messed up. So we use organisms to detoxify ecosystems, and the organisms most often used are prokaryotes, or fungus, or plants. These organisms can take up and sometimes metabolize toxic molecules. For instance, the bacterium Shewanella onidensis can metabolize uranium. Uranium is very bad, it's radioactive, and other elements to insoluble forms that are less likely to leach into streams and into groundwater, so we wouldn't get contaminated. So we could use this bacterium to help us clean up our mess. We could also do biological augmentation. This one requires organisms to add essential materials to a degraded ecosystem. So we've already messed it up, and now we're going to use organisms to go and fix it. Like nitrogen fixing plants, we could plant those and they can increase the available nitrogen in the soil. Or we can add mycorrhizal fungus, which can help plants access nutrients from the soil that's already poor. Biomes. So now we're going to look at biomes. Biomes are defined as the world's major communities, classified according to predominant vegetation and characterized by adaptations of organisms to that particular environment. So we're going to look at 5 major biomes: aquatic, desert, forest, grasslands, and tundra. And each of them has energy cycling and matter cycling. So the first thing we need to understand is what is going on in the world. We have these oceans, and every time you see a blue arrow, that's a cold current. And every time you see a red arrow, that's a warm current. And so what we see, lots and lots of warm currents around these areas. Lots of warm currents here, lots of warm currents here, and then cold currents here, cold currents here, and cold currents here. So this actually will help us understand the winds, which is right here. So right now, you have, because of these currents, they're major gyres, and these are circulation centers that mix the oceans together. So if you look at the major ocean currents touching the U.S., we have the California current, so that's this one. We have the Gulf Stream current, that's this one. We have the Labrador current, that's this one. We have the Peruvian current, that's number 4, well, that's South America. We have the North Pacific Equatorial Current, which is this one, and the South Pacific Equatorial Current, which is this one, and that would be in Hawaii, and the West Wind Drift, or the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, and that's this one. So those are the major ocean currents. We only have 3 that actually touch us. This one, that one, and that one. Major ocean circulation gyres are clockwise in the northern hemisphere, but they're counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And why are they mixing? The cold waters of the California current results in low evaporation from the ocean, leaving the western United States relatively dry. And the warm waters of the Gulf Stream results in high evaporation from the ocean, leaving the eastern U.S. relatively dry. So we have these ocean currents that modify our biomes. We also have something called the Thermohaline Circulation, and that's deep water. So what happens because of these ocean currents, we also have, so when you look at the salinity of the oceans, anything that is very, very yellowish, highly saline, and anything that's blue, which is around here, which is very little salinity. But what is happening is there is a thermohaline circulation where the water gets warmed up and it rises and then falls down in where it gets cooled at the Arctic, and then it comes down and wends its way like this, then it warms up over here in the Indian Ocean and comes down, warms up, and warms our coasts over here. So this is a deep current, and these also affect our biomes. Here are the ocean currents one more time, and it shows you warm currents in red, cold currents in blue, and currents that are not hot or cold in black. So this shows you how this modifies the areas where we live. Here we also see that how we have messed up some stuff. So there's an estimated 200 million tons of plastic in our oceans, and because of these currents, we have a great big one on the East Pacific Gyre and a West Pacific Gyre. They're great big garbage patch currents. There's in these gyres, you can find two great big ones. There are also gyres in the South Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, South Pacific, and the North Atlantic, and they not just pollute the oceans, but they also hinder the animals that are there who don't understand what this is. They simply eat it and then they die. So this is what our oceans look like with garbage patches inside them. So there's a lot of it that collects in these gyres, and here is more showing you how much of it, and that's actually a person standing on one of these islands of gyres of garbage patches in the oceans. Here's a picture taken from far away, so you can see these big floating islands of trash and more of it. So we are actually, and you can see the size of how much of it. So the tires, these are all tires that are at the bottom of the ocean. You can see how much garbage we're just polluting everywhere. A lot of it. Anyway, so the first biome we're going to look at is the aquatic biome. 70% of the earth is covered by water, and the aquatic freshwater, the aquatic biomes, there are two. There's either a freshwater or a marine biome. Freshwater is considered fresh if it's less than 1% salt, and so those would be ponds, lakes, streams, rivers, and wetlands. Marine biomes are those that are oceans and estuaries. In the oceans, there are actually 4 zones, and each zone is its own biome. There's an intertidal, a pelagic, abyssal, and benthic zone. Let's look at the aquatic ones that have the freshwater ones with ponds and lakes first. Ponds and lakes, well, they can range from a few meters to thousands of meters, and some of them are remnants of the Pleistocene glaciation, and some can be seasonal, and they usually have 3 zones. So each pond or lake will have a topmost zone, which is called a littoral zone, and that's the warmest and the most shallow zone, and it will sustain a fairly diverse community. Then after that, underneath that is the limnetic zone. It's a well-lighted zone, and it's dominated by plankton. Underneath that, well, plankton have very short lifespans. When they die, they're going to fall into the deep water part of the lake of the pond, which is called the profundal zone. It's much colder, there's a little light, and the fauna are generally heterotrophs over here. So characteristics of a river or a stream change during the journey from the source to the mouth. So the temperature is cooler, it's clearer, there's higher oxygen levels at the source than it is at the mouth. In the middle part, the width increases, as does the species diversity, and at the mouth, which is the very end part of it, the water becomes murky from all the sediments. There's decreasing amount of light that can penetrate through the water, so there's less diversity of. Continuing on with the aquatic biomes, we have wetlands. Wetlands are areas of standing water that support aquatic plants like marshes, swamps, bogs. So there's always some standing water on the soil, and so the plants that live there have to adapt to these different conditions. Wetlands have the highest species diversity of all ecosystems. Wetlands are not considered freshwater ecosystems, as there's some, such as salt marshes, that have high salt concentrations, which support different species of animals such as shrimp and shellfish. So they're not really freshwater, but they can be, and they're not really saltwater, but they can be. Ocean biomes. So this is the largest of all the ecosystems. Oceans are very, very large bodies of water. They have 4 zones in an ocean. So there is an intertidal zone. That is where the ocean meets the land. So let's look at the 4 zones first. Let's list them first and then go over them. 4 zones are intertidal, pelagic, abyssal, and benthic. The intertidal zone is where the ocean meets the land, so communities are constantly changing, and different communities live on high tide and low tide areas. On rocky coasts, however, the zone is stratified vertically, and waves keep mud and sand constantly moving. So very, very few organisms can actually establish themselves. In the pelagic zone, that encompasses waters further from the land, and it's generally pretty cold. The benthic zone is the area below the pelagic zone. So now we're going vertically downwards. We were moving horizontally first away from the land, but now we're in the pelagic zone, which is far from any land. And now we're walking our way down to the bottom of the ocean. So from the pelagic zone, which is on the top, it's generally cold, but underneath that is the benthic zone, and the temperature decreases even more. There's no light. So this is where we're a few meters down, so sunlight cannot penetrate. And but it's very nutrient rich because all the decomposing matter is floating down into the benthic zone. But the very, very deep ocean is called the abyssal zone. The water in this region is really cold. It's very cold. It's around 3 degrees centigrade. It's very highly pressured because of all the weight of all that water on top of it. It has a very high oxygen content because a lot of oxygen has dissolved in it by now because of all that pressure, but it's very low in nutritional content. There's not a lot of carbon that's around that can be used. Mid-ocean ridges with hydrothermal vents are found in abyssal zones along the ocean floors, but there are chemosynthetic bacteria, and they actually thrive there. So we can have an abyssal zone that is pretty active in biology, but most of the abyssal zones are cold and dark and have not much going on at all. Continuing with aquatic biomes, we have estuaries. Estuaries are very interesting areas. These are areas where freshwater streams or rivers merge with the ocean. This mixing of waters with such different salt concentrations creates a unique ecosystem. Algae, seaweeds, marsh grasses, mangrove trees, but only in the tropics, can be found in estuaries. Estuaries support a diverse fauna, including a variety of worms, oysters, crab, and waterfowl. And you can understand this because here things are mixing. So the salt concentration is varying. There can be all kinds of animals living in the entire gradient of the salt concentration. And then we're going to look at desert biomes. So we looked at water, and now let's look at the absence of water. Actually, 1/5 of the Earth's surface is a desert. How do we define a desert? A desert is defined as something that has less than 50 centimeters of rainfall per year. There are 4 major types of desert, believe it or not. There are even types of deserts. The first type is hot and dry, and that's what we always think of. But then there are others: semi-arid, coastal deserts, and cold deserts. Soils in deserts often have abundant nutrients because they only need water. There are plenty of disturbances in desert biomes. They're common in the form of fires or cold weather and sudden intense rains that cause flooding. So let's look at each of the type of desert biomes separately. Let's look at the most popular one, which is hot and dry. Here, temperatures exhibit daily extremes because the atmosphere contains very little humidity to block the rays of the sun. So its maximum temperature can go up to 49 degrees centigrade, like the Sonoran Desert or the Mojave Desert. Desert surfaces receive a little more than twice the solar radiation received by humid regions and lose almost twice as much heat as at night. So this is pretty rough on any community that wants to live there. Sometimes rain will start to fall on a desert, but because it's so hot, it will evaporate before reaching the ground. So this is unusual because, you know, the ground is already parched, and we just need a little bit of rain for any plants to grow. And it rains, but it never reaches the ground, and it just evaporates before even getting to the ground because the ground is so hot. So that's sad. But there are still plants there. Plants include yuccas, prickly pears, agaves. The animals include small, very small nocturnal animals like carnivores, insects, arachnids, reptiles, and some birds. In the semi-arid deserts, so these examples would be like the sagebrush deserts of Utah and Montana. Here the temperatures don't go above 38 degrees centigrade. The average rainfall is actually 2 to 4 centimeters per year. The soil has low salt. It ranges from fine sand, so this should actually be from fine sand to gravel. So this desert is not all sandy. It does have some gravel in it. And the plants over here have glossy leaves to reflect the sun, and they have usually unfavorable odors and tastes so that they are not eaten, which is kind of mean because the animals do want to eat them. The animals that do exist around here are mostly burrowing. The coastal desert, so an example of that would be the Atacama Desert. Here, the average rainfall is about 8 to 13 centimeters per year. The soil is fine textured, it has a moderate salt content, it's fairly porous, and it has good drainage. Plants include the salt bush, the buckwheat bush, black bush, rice grass, and black sage. Animals, now in a coastal desert, actually you have a bigger variety because the rainfall has increased, so now there's more plants and there's a more diversity of animals too. So we have insects which were present everywhere, but we also have mammals like coyotes and badgers, so they're slightly bigger mammals, and we have amphibians like toads. We also have birds like the great horned owl, the golden eagle, the bald eagle, and then we have reptiles like lizards and snakes. So not the big animals, but medium-sized. The example of a cold desert would be the Antarctic or Greenland. Here, the snowfall and high overall rainfall, there's plenty of it, and there's a maximum of 46 centimeters per year. So there is snow. Maybe it's rain that turns into snow, because the temperatures range between -2 degrees centigrade and 20 degrees centigrade. The soil is heavy, silty, and salty. The plants are deciduous with spiny leaves. So deciduous are those that drop their leaves every season, and then they grow back the next year. But usually they're spiny because they want to reduce how much water evaporation how much water is being lost by evaporation. So the leaves are not nice and broad, they're spiny like pine trees. Animals would include jackrabbits and kangaroo rats, kangaroo mice, pocket mice, those small animals, grasshopper mice, antelope ground squirrels, lizards, deer. So now we're getting a little bit bigger, so we actually have deer, and carnivores like badger, kit fox, and coyotes. The forest biome. So forests occupy about 1/3 of the land area of the earth and account for about 2/3 of the leaf area of land plants and contain about 70% of carbon present in living organisms. So this is an extremely important biome because it has all these statistics that are really important for us. 3 major types of forest biomes are classified according to their latitude. They can be tropical, temperate, or boreal. Let's look at them one by one. The forest that is tropical. These lie in a belt between the latitudes of 23.5 degrees north of the equator and 23.5 degrees south of the equator. So it's this big band. There is distinct seasonality. Winter is usually not there. There are only 2 seasons. It's either a rainy season or it's a dry season. The length of daylight is only 12 hours. The temperature is generally there's not a lot of variation, and it's just between 20 and 25 degrees centigrade. So it's generally the same temperature almost every day. The precipitation is evenly distributed throughout the year, and the annual rainfall is about 200 centimeters or 2,000 millimeters. So there's a lot of rain, but it rains almost every day, or most days. And the soil is nutrient poor, and because of all this rain, it's acidic. The decomposition is pretty rapid, and that's also why the soil is acidic. The flora are pretty diverse. They're mostly evergreen plants. The fauna includes birds, bats, small mammals, and insects. In temperate forests, these would be the ones in eastern North America, Northeast Asia, and Western Europe. They have well-defined seasons and moderate climate. The temperature ranges between -30 degrees centigrade to +30 degrees centigrade. There is a lot of precipitation, about 75 to 150 centimeters a year, but it's mostly distributed evenly throughout the year, and the soil is fertile. The flora is, again, mostly deciduous trees like oak, hickory, beech, and maple. So these would be familiar trees to us. And the fauna includes squirrels, rabbits, skunks, birds, deer, and now we get to the big carnivores: mountain lions, bobcats, timber wolf, fox, and black bear. These are the big carnivores and omnivores. So this forest can actually support bigger mammals. Boreal forests are the largest terrestrial biome, and they're between 50 degrees north and 60 degrees north on the north of the equator. They're mostly, you would say, in Siberia. So 2/3 of the boreal forests exist in Siberia, and the rest exist in Alaska or Canada. Here the seasons are short, they're moist, when they have warm summers and long, cold, dry winters. Very low temperatures exist in boreal forests. The precipitation is mostly snow, to 40 to 100 centimeters annually. So no rain. The soil is nutrient poor and acidic, and the flora is mostly evergreen. So it's not deciduous, it's evergreen, so the leaves are there year-round. And they're conifers like pine trees, fir trees, spruce trees, and the fauna include woodpeckers, hawks, moose, bear, weasel, lynx, fox, wolf, deer, hares, chipmunks, shrews, and bat. So pretty wide diversity in the fauna and flora, despite very low precipitation as rain. There's also the hypothesis called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, and that states that local species diversity is maximized when ecological disturbance is neither too rare nor too frequent. So this is something that we should think about when we have all these biomes, and if there is some disturbance, because we did look at a little bit of disturbance earlier on. What happens? At low levels of disturbance, more competitive organisms will push subordinate species to extinction, and they will dominate the ecosystem. But if there's too much disturbance at high levels of disturbance due to frequent forest fires or human impacts like deforestation, all species are at risk of going extinct. So that's not good. According to this theory of intermediate disturbance hypothesis, at intermediate levels of disturbance, diversity is thus maximized because both competitive and opportunistic species can coexist. The theory applies to sessile species, so these would be species that cannot move. The intermediate disturbance hypothesis, like all theories, represents a simplification of competition interactions. But it is a useful framework for understanding the influence of disturbance on biodiversity within communities. So it may be a theory, it may be simplistic, it may be a model, but it does explain a whole bunch of things that are the main factors of communities. Opposing theories do state that diversity is highest in undisturbed ecosystems. But the intermediate disturbance hypothesis says disturbance can increase biodiversity. It doesn't have to be the undisturbed. that brings us to ecological succession. So ecological succession refers to an orderly change in the composition or structure of an ecological community. The succession may be initiated either by the formation of new unoccupied habitat. For instance, there might be a lava flow. There wasn't one before, and now all of a sudden a volcano erupts and there's lava flow, and so now there's a new habitat, and it's completely unoccupied because nothing grows there for a while. Or there's a severe landslide. Again, there was maybe some habitat there before, life was flourishing. The land all crumbled, and now it's a totally new ecosystem because now there's new species have to be established one more time. Or by some form of disturbance like fire or logging of an existing community. So you could overlog, and then you would have a new habitat, or you could have a fire and all the existing creatures that were there living are dead, and now you have to start all over. The trajectory of ecological change can be influenced by factors that contribute to the predictability of succession, or by more probabilistic elements like weather conditions. In general, communities in early succession will be dominated by fast-growing, well-dispersed, opportunist species. That makes sense, because who's going to come there first after there's a new habitat? They have to be fast-growing species, they have to be well-dispersed, and they have to be opportunistic. They're looking for this opportunity, so they grab it. But as succession proceeds, these species will tend to be replaced by more competitive species. And that is generally the case, because if you have ever seen an area with a lava flow, first the lava has to cool down and becomes all black, solid rock, and then gradually over time, little cracks will start developing, tiny little grasses, and very small plants will start emerging. And then as the grasses start to take hold over the lava that's all solidified, they will change the lava, and it becomes soil. And then once there's soil, then the bigger plants can start taking over, and you end up with very big forests that originally were on places that had just lava flows. So that happens, and that's just general succession. Here is a picture of succession after a disturbance, like a wildfire. So on this side of the picture, which I cut into half, you see a boreal forest 1 year after a fire. So it looks kind of dead. And there may be a little patch of something trying to get back. But notice they're all just grasses. Well, 2 years after the fire, the grasses are now taken over. Now you see green everywhere. And you're going to you see some green over here, so some of those plants are now coming back. So this is kind of cool. So after a disturbance, it doesn't take that long for something to come back. And this shows you a succession of a forest. So I know it looks a little bit complicated, but it's really not. So let's, just like I was explaining on the lava and the forest, well, this actually shows you that. So you start out with bare rock right here. Okay, so one shows you bare rock. And then after you have bare rock, it'll stay bare for a while. But notice after a little while, some time has passed, grasses and mosses are starting to take over. And now the rock is no longer bare. In fact, in a little while, the rock is going to be all covered with grasses. So once it's all covered, notice that other plants are starting to move on in. So these are perennials. And these are going to shove out the grasses. So the grasses are going to start declining. But while these perennials are reaching their peak, you will see other creatures, other plants show up. Those are the woody pioneers. And they will start eating up this habitat and establishing themselves as the grasses, perennials start to decline. And as these woody pioneers are taking off, and really thriving, what you will have then immediately are fast-growing trees starting to show up in. So see, at the same time, this is happening at the same time as things are getting to a peak. These are sneaking on in. And then as this fast-growing tree scenario gets to its peak, you can see that you'll ultimately end up with a climax forest. And you can see this all in the pictures depicted below. So the bare rock, which we saw here, is that. But soon it gets occupied by grasses and mosses, and then little perennials will start showing up, and then grasses will be moved on out, and then the woody pioneers, fast-growing trees, and then you'll have a real forest. And notice all these other guys got shoved out, and this is just a succession of a forest as time passes. So if you look at the graph at the bottom, you can see that the biodiversity increases with time, the biomass increases with time, and the soil layers increase with time, because here you just had this one thin soil layer over here, and over here there's a lot soil and very little basement rock. So that shows you how a forest actually succeeds in time. Opportunistic or pioneer species produce great quantities of seeds, which are disseminated by the wind, which colonize big empty areas. Once they've produced a closed canopy, the lack of direct sunlight on the soil makes it difficult for their own seedlings to develop. It is then that the opportunity for shade-tolerant species to get established under the protection of the pioneers. So these start to show up when the pioneers die. The shade tolerance will replace them. So they just kind of sneak on in, wait in the wings. When the pioneers will die, the shade tolerance will show up. And then when an important catastrophe arrives, then it's the opportunity for the pioneers to show up again. So that opportunity window opens up again for them. So when we talk about fire ecology, there is a linkage of the natural incidence of fire in an ecosystem and its effects. Many ecosystems, such as the North American prairie and the South African savanna, have evolved with fire as a natural and necessary contributor to habitat vitality and renewal. We hear about forest fires all the time in California and other places, and it sounds really bad, but and it is. It is, but this is natural when it is natural and it's not caused by some camper, and this is a way of renewing the soil and the ecosystem in nature's way. Many plant species in naturally fire-affected environments require fire to germinate, so they've already adapted to this. Fire suppression, which we try to do, can lead to the buildup of inflammable debris and the creation of less frequent but much larger destructive wildfires. So we might not want to tamper with that too much. The next biome that we can look at is the Grassland Biome. Grasslands, how do we characterize them? They're lands dominated by grasses rather than shrubs or trees. The climate here is favorable to grasslands, and these arose in the Miocene and the Pliocene epochs. The forest declined, hotter and drier climates prevailed worldwide, and so we ended up with biomes, entire biomes of grasslands. There are two main divisions of biomes of grassland, and they're called the savannas and the temperate grassland. The temperate grasslands are the second division of grasslands as we know them. Here again, the grasses are the dominant vegetation, and the trees and large shrubs are completely absent. So those would be the veldts of South Africa, the pampas of Argentina and Uruguay, the steppes of the former Soviet Union, and the plains and the prairies of central North America. So we have temperate grasslands. Temperate grasslands have hot summers and cold winters, seasonal drought with occasional fires. Rainfall is moderate, soil is deep and dark and nutrient-rich. The flowers include asters and coneflowers and goldenrods and sunflowers and clovers. And the fauna include gazelles, zebras, rhinoceroses, wild horses, lions, wolves, prairie dogs, jackrabbits, deer, mice, coyotes, foxes, skunks, badgers, blackbirds, meadowlarks, quails, sparrows, hawks, owls, snakes, grasshoppers, and spiders. Huge diversity in the temperate grassland. So now we're coming to the end. The Tundra Biome. This is where it's really cold. So frost-molded landscapes, extremely low temperatures, these are the Earth's characteristics. Little precipitation, if at all, poor nutrients, and very short growing seasons. There's very low biotic diversity. There's a simple vegetation structure, and there's a short growth season. Energy and nutrients in the form of dead organic material are present. And they're big population oscillations. So sometimes you'll have an explosion of a population because the weather got a little favorable, and then the weather, tiny temperature change, and the entire population goes away, or most of it does, and so you have huge population oscillations. There are two types of tundra biomes, Arctic and alpine, and both are distinct. In the Arctic tundra, that encircles the North Pole down to the Boreal forests, and the growing season is very short. It's about 2 months, 50 to 60 days. The temperature ranges from 30 degrees to 54 degrees Fahrenheit, -30, so it's pretty cold. The yearly precipitation is about 6 to 10 inches. A layer of permanently frozen subsoil called permafrost exists. So there is this layer, and it's permanently frozen. So we call it permafrost because it's permanently there. And so the plants include shrubs and mosses, which can carry out photosynthesis at low temperatures and low light intensities. Most plants reproduce by budding and division rather than sexually by flowering. And that makes sense because it's very difficult to do sexual reproduction in plants in such a severely limited environment as an Arctic tundra. The fauna includes caribou, Arctic hares, squirrels, Arctic foxes, wolves, polar bears, so these are kind of big, ravens, falcons, loons, mosquitoes, flies, moths, grasshoppers, Arctic bumblebees, cod, salmon, trout. The reptiles and amphibians are either absent totally, or they may be just a few. It's too cold for them because they're cold-blooded, and they just don't do well in such a bad temperature. The alpine tundra is located on mountains at high altitude where trees cannot grow. The nighttime temperature is usually below freezing. Unlike the Arctic tundra, the soil in the alpine is well drained because it's on a mountain. The plants are very similar to those of the Arctic tundra, however, and the animals include goats, sheep, elk, beetles, grasshoppers, and butterflies. So now that we've looked at all these biomes, we can talk about ecosystems. And what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of living organisms, which would be the plants, animals, and microbes, along with their non-living components of the environment. So that would be the air, water, and mineral soil. So an ecosystem has a living and a non-living component to it. The biotic and abiotic components are regarded as linked by nutrient cycles and energy flows. Ecosystems can be of any size, but usually encompass specific limited spaces. Ecosystems are controlled by external and internal factors. The external factors would be something like climate, or soil and topography, or time, or potential biota. The internal factors control the availability of resources, the disturbances, the succession, the types of species present, and are subject to feedback loops. Ecosystems are dynamic entities subject to periodic disturbances. Here is what we can see. This is an example of eutrophication. So here, I think this is a picture of the Potomac. What we have is a bunch of sewage that has gone into the Potomac, and you see this algal bloom, this area where nothing is going to grow because they plankton are on the top and they're choking off life at the bottom. So they'll take all the nutrients away. No oxygen will be left in the bottom layer of water underneath them. So no other animals can live there. So that is caused by us, by dumping sewage in, and it's called killing a lake or eutrophication. Eutrophication is defined as simply the addition of artificial or natural substances, such as nitrates and phosphates, through fertilizers, sewage, stuff like that, to an aquatic system. It occurs naturally too, so we shouldn't be blaming ourselves all the time, but it does occur naturally due to runoff and floodwaters. But when it occurs naturally, it's ephemeral, which means it lasts a very short amount of time. We, on the other hand, dump sewage and fertilizers in on a daily basis, so it's not ephemeral, it's permanent. Most eutrophication, therefore, is a result of human intervention. Simple algae and plankton are favored over more complicated plants in eutrophication. So this disrupts the normal functioning of the ecosystem, causing a variety of problems, including a lack of oxygen needed for fish and shellfish. So anything at the bottom will just can't breathe. The water becomes cloudy, typically a shade of green, yellow, brown, or even red. Here is a diagram showing you eutrophication. So here what we see is, the land. Here's nice fresh water going in. However, and we have a nice healthy benthane community of worms, shells, bivalves living around here. But if we start to dump stuff on top, like instead of fresh river water, we start dumping sewage, what we're going to get is a layer of sewage would have nitrogen, phosphorus, silicon, stuff like that. And so that is going to create phytoplankton to come and hang out over here to eat that. They will also attract zooplankton. And so you'll get all this area, oxygen will just be sucked up by these guys and blocked for the guys that are living underneath. So they won't have any oxygen left to breathe in. And if they can escape, great, but if they can't, they just die. So there is an actual line called the Picnoc line, which actually determines where the mixing occurs and how much it can occur for the animals underneath to continue living. Notice that there is upwelling of nutrients and oxygen from the lower parts, if there is a lower part, and the heavier, saltier and cooler lower layer would be below the Picnoc line. So they're delicately balanced systems, and they can get disrupted or disturbed very easily. So here is the Potomac River, a picture taken of it. It looks kind of disgusting because now, instead of being a pretty blue, you see all of this eutrophication. The bright color is actually a dense bloom of cyanobacteria. So besides the cyanobacteria, we have, so these are the cyanobacteria. We will also have zooplankton, cyanobacteria, phytoplankton, and they're little creatures that live in ponds and areas that are dirty that are zooplankton. In Asia, it's a big problem for eutrophication. It's a big problem now because of the explosion in human population. In Asia, about 54% of the lakes are eutrophic. In Europe, about the same. In North America, about the same. In South America, a little bit better. And in Africa, a little bit better. So 28% of the lakes are eutrophic, which is not good. Humankind has increased the rate of phosphorus cycling on the earth by 4 times, mainly due to agricultural fertilizer production and application. We want to grow more food to feed all those new people. And to do that, we need to cycle phosphorus faster than it should, or it has been. And when we do that, we kill the lakes, or the lakes get eutrophication happens on lakes. During 1950 to 1995, which is not even 50 years, an estimated 600 million tons of phosphorus was applied to the Earth's surface, primarily on croplands. There's also saltwater eutrophication, so it's not just our fresh water. Nitrogen is more commonly the key limiting nutrient of marine waters. Estuaries tend to be naturally eutrophic because land-derived nutrients are concentrated where runoff enters a confined channel. But upwelling in coastal systems also promotes increased productivity by conveying deep nutrient-rich waters to the surface where the nutrients can be assimilated by algae. What are the ramifications of eutrophication? Eutrophication for ecology, how does it work? Well, overstimulating the primary production results in decreased biodiversity, changes in species composition and dominance, and toxicity effects, like increased biomass of the phytoplankton, which could be toxic or inedible, increase in the blooms of gelatinous zooplankton, decrease in the biomass of benthic and epiphytic algae, changes in the macrophyte species composition and biomass, decrease in water transparency, which means increased turbidity, color and smell problems, dissolved oxygen depletion, loss of desirable fish species, and invasion by new species outcompeting the original inhabitant. Mitigation. How do we fix this problem that we have created? Well, we have riparian buffer zones. They're created near waterways in an attempt to filter out pollutants. Riparian means river, and so that just means river. These create interfaces between a flowing body of water and the land to catch the sediment. So we've created some of these. Creating buffer zones near farms and roads is another possible way to prevent nutrients from traveling too far. Still, the effect of atmospheric nitrogen pollution can reach far past the buffer zone, suggesting that the most effective means of prevention is from the primary source. So here are the sources of cultural eutrophication. So we discharge untreated municipal waste. So those would be nitrates and phosphates. We dump them in the river. The nitrogen compounds produced by cars and by factories, and they go up in the atmosphere and they come down as rain, going into the fresh water again. We use soap, and those are phosphates, so they also go into the river. Then there's natural runoff of nitrates and phosphates. Then we use fertilizer in farms, and more nitrates and phosphates are rushing into the fresh water. Then we have animals which have feeds, and they have excretions. So the manure runoff will also have nitrates and phosphates and ammonia. We also have runoff from streets, lawns, construction lots. This is all nitrates and phosphates. We have runoff from erosion, from cultivation, mining, construction, and poor land use. We have also dissolving of nitrogen oxides from combustion engines and furnaces in our factories. And then we discharge treated municipal sewage. So we might treat it, but we don't get rid of everything, and so nitrates and phosphates still go into our fresh water. So that is how we're polluting our waters. Well, in ecosystems we also have cycles. So while we do disrupt some of it, or we might speed up some, we should look at what the cycles are. So the carbon cycle works like this. So you can start anywhere in a cycle. And if you start with a plant over here, this has organic carbon. It's going to take in light by photosynthesis. It'll decay. There are organisms living under here, and the dead organisms are just under the ground. This is all organic carbon. We have animals that will respire the carbon dioxide, and which will go into the atmosphere. And then, of course, the dead organisms are buried under the ground. Plant respiration also gives off carbon into the atmosphere. And then we have factories which give off carbon in the atmosphere. So that's how we get carbon in the atmosphere. How we lose it is we would be burying it with dead organisms, dead plants, and things like that. The nitrogen cycle is another cycle that that exists in every ecosystem, and so of course the atmosphere is mostly nitrogen, but we cannot use molecular nitrogen, so we have very small bacteria that can actually use nitrogen, and they can convert it into nitrates, which are taken up by plants, which are then eaten by herbivores, and so we can actually get the nitrogen from here. We do get some precipitation out by from the atmosphere through electricity, lightning, and we will generally lose more than we can get in. The phosphorus cycle is one of the slowest cycles in an ecosystem because the phosphorus is locked up in rocks. Okay, so the rocks have to be somehow brought to the surface first. So there has to be some geological upheaval, and this inorganic phosphate has to then weather by rain and go into the plants, which can be eaten by other animals, and then cycle right here. But once it gets dissolved, it can go into oceans and rocks and be locked back up again. So it's a very slow cycle. Food chains and food webs. So while we have these cycles and we have ecosystems, and then, well, we need to see how the energy is cycling in and out of them, and that is cycled in and out by food chains and food webs. Food chains and food webs are representations of the predator-prey relationships between species within an ecosystem or a habitat. Many chain and web models can be applicable depending on the habitat or environmental factors. Every known food chain has a base made out of autotrophs. So autotrophs are organisms able to manufacture their own food, like plants or chemotrophs. In almost all food chains, solar energy as light and heat is utilized by the autotrophs by photosynthesis, and carbon dioxide is reduced to produce glucose by combining with water. Carbon dioxide and water, both stable oxidized compounds, are low in energy, but glucose, a high-energy compound, is capable of storing solar energy. Glucose is used to make fats and proteins. When autotrophs are eaten by heterotrophs, the carbohydrates, fats, and proteins contained in them become energy sources for the heterotrophs. Food energy flows from one organism to the next, with some energy being lost at each level. A large amount of energy is lost at each link, so the amount of energy that is transferred gets less and less the further along the food chain. Here's the food chain, and what you see is energy coming from the sun, trapped by photosynthesis, and then eaten by, say, a grasshopper. Some eat some of the grass, which is then eaten by a carnivore or a mouse, which is then eaten by another carnivore, which is a snake, and then that's eaten by the last one in the chain, which is a hawk. Well, when these guys die, then all these nutrients are cycled back into the soil and taken back. But you see there's only how many links? 1, 2, 3, 4, and we start out with a autotroph. There are usually never more than 4 or 5 links in a food chain, because at every level a whole bunch of energy is lost. In a few food chains, like near hydrothermal vents in the ocean, as shown in this picture. So this is a hydrothermal vent in the ocean, and you can see all these nutrients cycling out of the underground volcano, all this black stuff spewing out, and you can see all these animals living here, these tube worms. So these creatures can actually produce organic compounds without sunlight through chemosynthesis, using a carbon source such as carbon dioxide and a chemical energy source such as hydrogen sulfide or molecular hydrogen. Unlike water, hydrogen compounds used in chemosynthesis are high in energy. So again, life can survive without sunlight, but only under very special conditions. Food chains are overly simplistic as representatives of the relationships of living organisms in nature. Plants are called producers because they're able to use light energy from the sun to produce food from carbon dioxide and water. Animals cannot make their own food, so they must eat plants or other animals and are called consumers. Most consumers feed on multiple species and in turn are fed upon by multiple other species. So food chains can be linked into food webs. Most food chains have no more than 4 or 5 links. Okay, please remember this. You cannot have more than 4 or 5 links. Though aquatic ecosystems usually are a little bit longer than terrestrial ones. The reason why there cannot be too many links in a single food chain is because animals at the end of the food chain would not get enough food or energy to stay alive. Most animals are part of more than one food chain and eat more than one kind of food in order to meet their food and energy requirements. And these interconnected food chains form a food web. So a food web is a series of related food chains displaying the movement of energy and matter through an ecosystem. The food web is divided into 2 broad categories: the grazing web, beginning with autotrophs, and the detrital web, beginning with organic debris. There are many food chains contained in these 2 food webs. In a grazing web, the energy and nutrients move from plants to the herbivores consuming them, to the carnivores that consume them, to the omnivores preying on them and the herbivores. But in the detrital web, the plant and animal matter is broken down by decomposers, which would be bacteria and fungus, and moves to detritivores and then to carnivores. So the web interrelationships, there are often relationships between the detrital web and the grazing web. Like for instance, mushrooms produced by decomposers in the detrital web become a food source for deer and squirrels and mice in the grazing web. And earthworms eaten by robins are detritivores, and they consume decaying leaves. So they're actually interconnected, both of them. They're not separate. And that brings us to trophic levels to show you the links between a food chain. Organisms in a food chain are grouped into trophic levels based on how many links they are removed from the primary producers. Autotrophs, or primary producers, are in the first trophic level and are at the base of the food chain. They're always at the base of the food chain. Okay? Herbivores, or primary consumers, are in the second trophic level. Carnivores, or secondary consumers, are in the third trophic level, and omnivores are found in the second or the third, or both, levels. Predators preying on other predators are tertiary consumers or secondary carnivores, and therefore found in the fourth trophic level. Okay, so we are omnivores, so we live in the second and third trophic level, but anybody who would prey on us, which are not many species, they like for instance a lion would eat us, and they would be in the fourth trophic level. In trophic levels, there may be one species or a group of species with the same predators and prey. The biomass of each trophic level decreases from the base of the chain to the top. That is because energy is lost to the environment with each transfer as entropy increases. And this is the second law of thermodynamics, and we know this because we looked at this a long time ago. And we know about 80 to 90% of the energy is expended for the organism's life processes or is lost as heat or waste. So the organism has to keep on eating. So only about 10 to 20% of the organism's energy is passed on to the next organism. Sometimes the amount can be less than 1% in animals consuming less digestible plants, and it can be high as 40% in zooplankton consuming phytoplankton. So it ranges between 1 and 40, but generally speaking, it's about 10 to 20%. And this is what it would look like. So this is an energy pyramid. It shows a lot of trees and shrubs. You have to have a big, broad base of a pyramid. They would provide food for a few giraffe. Okay, not a lot, because the giraffe have to move around in the forest, eat one side of it, and then they move to the other side while this regrows, and then they can move back and eat that, and they can keep on going back and forth and back and forth. But they need a big forest to support themselves. So only this many will be able to be supported by a forest, say, that size. But that many giraffes can only support one lion, because a lion he doesn't eat once in a year, he would eat many times, and so there have to be many giraffes that he has to depend on, because he can't eat the plants. So as you see, that as we go higher up the pyramid, there's a large biomass at the bottom of the pyramid, but a very small biomass at the top of the pyramid, because very many herbivores are needed to support a few carnivores. The change in the size of one population in a food chain will affect populations, as that's pretty apparent. And this interdependence of populations within a food chain helps maintain the balance of plant and animal populations within a community. For example, when there are too many giraffes, there will be insufficient trees and shrubs for all of them to eat. Many giraffes are going to then starve and die. But if there are fewer giraffes, that means more times for the trees and shrubs to grow to maturity and multiply. So they're good for the trees, but bad because fewer giraffes will mean less food available for the lions to eat, and some lions will starve to death too. So any disturbance in the population community numbers will affect drastically everybody else. So if there are fewer lions, then the giraffe population will spring back again. Here is a terrestrial food web, and you can see how the food chains are now connected. So you can see that there's a plant which has leaves and acorns eaten by a mouse, which is eaten by a snake, which is maybe eaten by this bird or some other bird. And then when the bird, if it does not have any more predators, when it dies, it decomposes, and the bacteria will decompose it, and which will go back into the tree and so on. Or you could go to this part of the food web where you have other kind of trees, pine cones, which are eaten by the pine tree is eaten by the pine borer, which can be eaten by a bird, which is swallowed by a snake, or these pine borers are little beetles, which will be eaten by salamanders, which can be eaten by a snake. And then the snake can be eaten by the big bird, and then ultimately the decomposers will take care of the rest. Here's the coastal food web, and it looks a little complicated, but it's not, because what we have are the tiny zooplankton and the phytoplankton starting it all out. And everybody, as you can see, from the direction of the arrows, they're eating this, and then they get eaten by this, and then they get eaten by that, and you keep on going around until the food chain is done. Here's an African food web, and so there are many chains that are now interconnected, because, for instance, the impala isn't just food for a hyena, but also food for a vulture. And it eats not just fungus, but it can also eat grasses. So these are all interconnected and becomes a big food web. Here is another food web. It's a freshwater food web, and it shows you the vegetation being eaten by various animals, and then the various animals going around being eaten by various things. And so here are the plankton and benthic algae and pelagic algae, and all getting eaten up by fishes, which are eaten up by birds, which are eaten up by a fox. And so that's a freshwater food web. Here's a marine food web, and you can see leopard seals and killer whales and penguins in it, all depending on the fish and the squid and the krill. This krill and the squid actually depend on diatoms and tiny water animals. So these might be very small compared to these, but they ultimately are very much dependent on them. So let's move on to demography. Now that we have explored all the animals and the inorganic parts of an ecosystem, let's look at us and what do we do in an ecosystem. So what is demography actually? It is a statistical study of the size, structure, and distribution of human populations explored both spatially and temporally. Temporally means in time and spatially means in space. Analyses can include criteria like education, nationality, religion, ethnicity, so we can divvy us up in many different ways. Fertility and mortality rates shape population stability too. There's actually a population equation. Populations can change through three processes: fertility, mortality, and migration. And a general equation representing a population change can be written as population at time plus 1, t plus 1, is equal to the population at that time plus the natural increase at that time plus the net migration at that time. So t is current time, and t plus 1 is going to be some other time. Natural increase, so let's look at this particular variable. That is itself an equation. It's births minus deaths. Net migration, let's look at that equation. That variable is the result of two variables, immigration minus emigration. Immigration means coming in, emigration means moving out. Population models. Malthus's model shows that if unchecked, populations are subject to exponential growth. So remember, exponential growth would look like, whoops, going up like this. Overstripping food production and leading to ever-increasing famine and poverty. That's Malthus, who's a very famous economist who showed us that. Currently, however, natural population growth in most developed countries has diminished to close to zero. And this is sort of a big problem, despite large rises in life expectancy due to decreased births. So that brings us to population structures. And we can depict the structures of a population by a pyramid. A population pyramid, also called an age structure diagram, is a graphical illustration that shows the distribution of various age groups in a human population in the shape of a pyramid. Population pyramids are analogous to a builder's blueprint for a house in showing population dynamics. So let's take a look at it. A population pyramid graph looks like this. First of all, when you notice this graph, don't be alarmed. We just tipped the x-axis. We joined two x-axes together. So these are actually two bar graphs, and we just bump the axes together. And so what you see is the population is plotted on the x-axis and the age is plotted on the y-axis. So remember, the y-axis is going this way and the number of people is going this way. So the left bar graph shows the number of males, okay, and the right bar graph shows the number of females in five-year groups. So this bar is 5 years. So this is 10 years. That's 15. That's males that are 20. How many are 25, 30, 35, and so on. A population pyramid also tells us how many people of each age range live in the area. Usually there are more females than males in older age groups due to longer female life expectancy. There are many pyramid types, and they're color-coded, so the left is always blue, which is boys, and the pink represent girls. So here is a pyramid type, which is called expanding. Notice that the bottom of the pyramid is big, and it tapers off like a pyramid should. And this next one is also considered expanding, although notice that the sides are not as deepened as the first one. However, this is a funny looking pyramid now. Now this is called a constrictive pyramid because now we're seeing bulges in these ages. And this last one is extremely strange, and that is called a contracting pyramid. So what you see is a small base, and then a bigger middle section, and then a smaller bit at top. So let's take a look at all of those. Generally speaking, a population pyramid that displays a population percentage of ages 1 to 14 more than 30% and ages 75% less than 66% is considered a young population. A population pyramid displays a population percentage of ages 1 to 14 less than 30% and ages 75 and above more than 6% is considered an aging population, which is what we have in Japan. A country that displays all or none of these characteristics is considered neither. So it's neither young, neither old, it's just one in between. Sometimes you see populations like this. So this is a very so this population of Afghanistan. What it shows you again. So the males are on this side. What it shows you is a base, and then notice how narrow this is. This is believed to contribute to social unrest, war, and terrorism, and some think it explains most genocides because what we have is an unstable situation going on that shows you that people are getting killed off rather rapidly as they get a little bit older. In China, what you see is something amazing. So people are not getting killed off rather rapidly. In fact, they're getting more and more and more. And then as they get older, they do die ultimately, but they manage to hang on for a very long time. This is the United States population graph, and what you see is, because of technology and advances in medicine, we don't die. We have managed to hang around for about 50 years. So this is a very stable population, and then ultimately we do end up dying. So not just the structure, there's also density of population which should be looked at. So population density is population divided by the total land area. So you need to know how many people are living in how much of a land. The world's population is about 6.8 billion, well, maybe a little bit more. The Earth's total area is fixed. It's 510 million square kilometers. Therefore, the worldwide human population density would just be, you divide those two numbers, and that should be about 13 people per square kilometer, which doesn't sound so bad, but there's a problem. The land mass, the 510 million square kilometers, is actually not all populated because some of it is mountains and people can't live there. Some of it is tundra and people can't live there. And some of it is desert and people can't live there. And so a lot of the places that we just looked at, people actually can't live there. So this is a problem. So if we take only 150 million kilometers squares out of the 150, which is about not 1/5, but a little bit more than that, then we have people living, 45 people living per square kilometer. And then when we talk about that, we actually haven't included, we haven't minused out all the land that we can't really look at, because that includes all the continental and island land area, including Antarctica. And this is a great big continent. So if we take Antarctica out, then we get to about 50 people per square kilometer, which is kind of dense. And here is a graph of the population density of the world, and the darker colors show you where most people are living, and the lighter colors show you less density in people living there. So when you see this would be the Sahara Desert, so nobody's living there. Australia, kind of very, very lightly populated. Siberia, not many people live there. Greenland, no. And then Canada, no, not really, because it's awfully cold there. Another desert here. So, places where the people are not living, you can actually see that although I said 50 people per square kilometer, that's an average. But when you actually look at the world's map, you see that it's 1,000 people, or more than 1,000 people per square kilometer living in this very small area, or here. And then up to 1,000 people in China. So pretty densely populated, I would say, in certain areas, and then not so densely populated in other areas. So we can actually look at populations, and we can look at the distribution or the range where there are actually dispersal patterns. So if we actually honed in on those pictures that I showed you of different land masses, we would see the population in patterns. So you could either see them clumped, like in cities, or random, or evenly spaced. So it's very interesting to see populations when you don't look at a person, but an entire group of people or communities. Small population size results in an increased genetic drift. So if there isn't a lot of people, if there are not a lot of people hanging around, the genetic drift rate actually increases, which leads to a higher probability of extinction. And population bottlenecks occur when population size reduces for a short period of time. So if this is time, and here is the population size. Okay, so we're going along and we're happily at one population, but then something happens, and generally speaking, maybe it's genetic drift, and now we're kind of not very well suited for any change to happen in the environment, and then suddenly a change happens. Well, most of the population is just going to die out. You might have a bottleneck event where you can have some recovery, or you might not recover and you would just go extinct like that. And that brings me to the end of this fascinating chapter. And actually, I will see you next time to finish up the class. Goodbye, students.